Chapter 3. Tomorrow will come if you survive today, one step at a time. The truck took me to the zoo, where I was detained in a hangar with other young Jewish men. When I arrived, there were 30 or so. All night, the thugs dragged more of us in, and when they had 150, they loaded us into another truck. As we drove, the other men told me about the disaster of Kristallnacht, about the looting, the burning of the synagogues. I was in shock, terrified, worried about my family. At the time, none of us understood that this was only the beginning of the nightmare. There was much, much worse to come as the truck left the city, and we were transported to Buchenwald concentration camp. The Nazi thugs had beaten me so badly that when I arrived in Buchenwald, bruised and bloodied, the commander panicked and had his guards drive me 38 kilometers to the nearest hospital. They left me there for 2 days, unguarded, while I recovered from my injuries under the care of German nurses. I asked one of them what would happen if I were to escape, and she looked at me sadly. "Do you have parents?" she asked. "Of course. If you were to try to escape, they would find your parents and hang them 15 minutes after you walk out the front door." This put all thought of escape out of my mind. I had no idea what had become of my parents. Had they escaped from Leipzig before the Nazis came? Had they found safety with a friend or relative? Or had the Nazis come for them? Had they been imprisoned elsewhere in Germany? I just didn't know, and my fear and worry kept me prisoner just as effectively as guards. When I had healed enough that I was no longer at death's door, the hospital called the Buchenwald camp and Nazi guards came to take me back. When I was delivered to Buchenwald, I was at first relieved. I had been given medical attention and I was surrounded by other Germans, most of them civilized, middle-class professionals. I even made friends with some of my fellow prisoners. My best friend there was Kurt Hirschfeld, a young German Jew from Berlin who had been arrested on Kristallnacht. Because of all this, I thought I would perhaps be safe. How wrong I was. Buchenwald was the largest concentration camp within Germany's borders. It was named for the beech forest that stood nearby, which became known as the Singing Forest for the screams that rang out from the prisoners who were tortured there. The first prisoners were communists, rounded up in one of the first Nazi purges in 1937, followed by many other people deemed subhuman by the Nazis: political prisoners, Slavs, Freemasons, and Jews. When we first arrived, the camp was not ready for the number of prisoners it would have to hold. There were no dormitories or barracks set up, so they herded us inside a giant tent where we slept on the floor until they could work out accommodation. At one point, 1,200 Czech men were housed in what had once been a stable for 80 horses. They slept 5 to a bunk, pushing the beds together and lying across them like sardines in a can. The conditions were so harsh that sickness and starvation were inevitable. History looks back at the horrors of the concentration camps of the Third Reich, and the images are well known. Images of Jews, starved, tortured, traumatized after the inhumanity of their persecution. But when I first arrived, that was all to come. At the start, we had no understanding of what our captors were capable of. Who could have imagined it? We could not fathom why we had been rounded up and imprisoned. We weren't criminals. We were good citizens, hardworking, regular Germans who had jobs and pets and loved our families and our country. We had taken pride in our dress and our positions in society, enjoying music and literature, and good wine and beer and 3 square meals a day. Now, the standard meal was 1 bowl of rice and stewed meat. You could tell the important political prisoners by the heavy chains they were forced to wear, binding their ankles to their wrists. These chains were so short and heavy that they could not stand while they ate and had to hunch over their dishes. We weren't given spoons, so had to eat with our hands. This wouldn't have been so bad if the conditions weren't so unsanitary. We had no toilet paper and had to wipe our backsides with whatever rags we could find, or with our hands. There was no proper toilet either. Instead, we had a giant pit latrine, a long trench, and we would be forced to go at the same time as up to 25 other men. Can you imagine the sight? 25 men, doctors, lawyers, academics, carefully balancing on 2 planks of wood to relieve themselves over a pit full of human waste. My friend, how to explain how surreal and horrible this all was to me? I could not understand what had happened. I still don't understand it. Not really. I don't think I ever will. We were a nation that prized the rule of law above all else. A nation where people did not litter because of the inconvenience it caused to have messy streets. You could be fined 200 marks for throwing a cigarette but out your car window. And now it was acceptable and encouraged for people to beat us. We would be beaten for very minor infractions. One morning, I slept through the bell for head count and was whipped. Another time, I was thrashed with a rubber baton for having my shirt untucked. Each morning, the Nazis would play a terrible game. They would open the gates and let 200 to 300 people go. When the poor people had made it 30 or 40 meters, the machine's guns would start, gunning them down like animals. They would undress the bodies, put them in body bags, and send them home with a letter saying, "Your husband/brother/son tried to escape and died in the process." The proof would be the bullet in his back. This was how the bastards solved their overpopulation problem at Buchenwald. Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of unified Germany, once warned the world to watch out for the German people. With a good leader, they were the greatest nation on earth. With a bad leader, they were monsters. For the guards who persecuted us, discipline was more important than common sense. If a soldier is told to march, they will march. If they are told to shoot a man in the back, they will do it and never question if it is right or wrong. The Germans made a religion of logic, and it turned them into murderers. Quickly, many saw death as a better alternative to life in Buchenwald. I knew a dentist, Dr. Cohen, who was beaten so badly by the SS that his stomach ruptured, and he began to die a slow, agonizing death. He paid 50 marks, about a week's wages, for a smuggled razor blade. A man of science, he calculated exactly which arteries he needed to cut and how long it would take him to die. He made a plan to sit on the lavatory, right in the middle, at exactly the right time, so that he would have 17 minutes before a guard came, which is how long he'd calculated he would need to lose enough blood to die. Then he would fall into the toilet so they couldn't pull him out, or they would wash him off, sew him up, punish him, and tell him, "You die when we want you to die, not before." This poor man succeeded in his grim mission. He escaped the Nazis on his own terms. This was Germany, 1938, completely transformed. No morals, no respect, no human decency. But not all the Germans were without reason. One of the first Nazi soldiers I saw after coming to Buchenwald was a familiar face, a man from my boarding house when I was studying engineering. His name was Helmut Hoher, and he had always been friendly to me, back when I was living under the assumed identity of Walter Schleif. "Walter," he said, "what are you doing here?" "I'm not Walter," I told him. "I'm Eddie." I spat on his shoes, told him how shocked I was, who I really was, that I could not believe this man, once a friend of mine, a good man, was now a guard for the SS. Poor Helmut. He didn't know I was Jewish. I have never seen someone so confused and so panicked. He told me he wanted to help me, that he couldn't let me escape, but he would do what he could. He went to the commander of the camp and told him that I was a good man and that I was an exceptional toolmaker. The Nazis needed toolmakers. The Third Reich was preparing for Der Total Krieg, total war against the world. In total war, there was no difference between soldier and civilian, guilty and innocent, military and industry. German society was being entirely reorganized to make weapons of war. So anyone who had any expertise in machinery or manufacture was a potential asset to the war effort. Not long after Helmut vouched for me, I was summoned to the commander's office. They asked me if I wanted to work for them. Yes. For the rest of your life? Yes. It cost nothing to say yes. The Jews had become the scapegoat, as they had been time and time again over the centuries, but the hunger for money and productivity in the Third Reich still overpowered the insanity of pure hatred. We were in prison, but if the German state could make money out of us, then we were still useful to them. They made me sign a contract of employment and a statement to say that they looked after me well, they had fed me, and that my time in the camp had been comfortable, and then they made plans for my transfer. As part of the deal, They allowed my father to pick me up from Buchenwald and take me home to spend a few hours with my mom, and then escort me to the factory where they would put me to work until the day I died. After Kristallnacht, he and my family had returned to Leipzig and had been quietly waiting for times to get better. Although they wanted to flee Germany, they would not leave me behind. My father was overjoyed, having found an opportunity to win my freedom. On May 2nd, 1939, at 7 a.m., my father picked me up in a hired car. I left Buchenwald 6 months after I'd arrived. My friend, can you imagine how good it felt to leave? For my father to drive up to the gates of Buchenwald and embrace me? To climb into the passenger side and drive off to freedom? This was paradise, a feeling of freedom and the end to persecution. I would remember this feeling often in the years to come and remind myself that if I could survive one more day, an hour, a minute, then the pain would end and tomorrow would come.